Hey there, Parker X listeners. This is Brett Wood coming at you with another blast from the past episode. We recorded this in early 2020 in Charlotte, North Carolina, with a couple of platform directors with Passport. Luke Segars and Kate Wagner sat down and chatted with me. It does have a little age. Kate has moved on to Amazon from Passport, much to the chagrin of many of her colleagues there. We hope you're doing well, Kate. In this episode, we talked about a few of my favorite topics: curb management, mobility, and the role of technology in supporting effective curb management. While we recorded this pre-COVID, a lot of the information is still valid and can help with a lot of communities as they think about their post-COVID recovery plan. So hope you get something out of it. Hope you enjoy. Hey, this is Brett Wood with Parker X. We're in Charlotte, North Carolina on a very gloomy day today outside with some folks at Passport where it's not gloomy inside. They're doing yoga right outside the room here. I'm with Luke Segars and Kate Wagner, who are both platform directors at Passport, and they're going to tell us a little bit about what they do and how Passport's kind of changing the mindset of the industry. So maybe if y'all could start off with just tell me how you got into parking, how you got here to Passport, and just your history.
Yeah, well, thanks for having us, Brett. So this is Luke Segars, and I've been at Passport for a little over 2 years now. I stumbled into it, to be honest. Came for a conversation, turned into an interview, and I got hooked pretty quickly. But I'm not someone who has been in mobility or municipal anything prior to this. I came from the tech industry and have been really intrigued by data and just kind of solving hard product problems since I started working. And so that's what really intrigued me about Passport. It wasn't immediately the parking part of it, but the more I learned, the more I came to appreciate how important some of the things that are happening in the industry are, not only for parking, but for how people move around and for what cities are trying to do in the future.
Perfect. Kate?
Yeah, and I'm Kate Wagner. I'm the Director of Urban Mobility at Passport. Prior to coming to Passport, I've been here for a little over a year now. I actually worked at General Motors, and that's kind of how I got into the mobility space. So I started out in product roles working on electric vehicles at General Motors, and then transitioned to working in strategy and worked on a lot of new mobility business models, and that's really when I got really interested in and developed a passion for urban mobility. And that work there, that led me to Passport, and I really admired what the company was doing and found I was really invested in, I think, their vision for the future and moving more towards a mobility platform than just being a parking company, and that's really what drew me to Passport.
Nice. And Passport's, in parking standards, a fairly young company. It's only been around for, 10 years?
Upper limit 10 years. I think it's 7 to 10 years.
That might be a little generous. Yeah, I think probably about 8.
Yeah, fair enough. So, and in those 8 years, y'all have evolved from what seemed like it was largely just a payment platform into a group that's really trying to change the way we think about everything associated with our industry. So you maybe take me through that evolution a little bit, what it's been like to go from parking payment into much bigger things.
Yeah, I think part of this is it's a big advantage for us to only be 7 to 10 years old, I think, compared to a lot of other of our traditional competitors, I guess you would say. It's also been a kind of a right time, right place sort of thing, because I think if you would have had a 10-year-old company working in parking anytime in the past 100 years prior to now, there would have been less interesting stuff going on. But things are happening pretty quickly now. A lot of them have nothing to do with Passport, but they give us a ton of opportunities to continue to expand and to continue to push back beyond what we've always done. So I think one of the things that's been really clarifying over the past 2 years has been there's been a lot of movement of private companies and alternative methods of moving around that have shown up. So the Ubers and Lyfts, the micromobility companies. And one of the things that's been really clarifying for us and differentiates us from a lot of folks who are out there solving similar problems is the fact that we have a pretty extensive municipal client base. And so having cities be our client and already having hundreds, close to 1,000 municipal contracts puts us in a pretty unique place where we can not only get the point of view of all those cities, but also recognize problems and get to work solving them for a bunch of clients without having to go through what is sometimes a particularly long sales cycle that cities sometimes lead to. So
yeah, so I mean, in the convergence of like the different platforms, I know early on, parking payment, transit payment seemed to be two things that you were doing and doing well, the convergence of those things. And now thinking about all those other modes in one app, in one place, and managing that both from the municipal side but also from the customer side. Kind of take me through how y'all are thinking about that and how y'all are trying to change that dynamic.
Yeah, so I think, one thing that I found really compelling about Passport, and I kind of identified as a reason why I wanted to come here, is that I actually felt like relative to, other companies who have either been in the parking space and are trying to, move into more of a digital solution, I felt like Passport actually had, right to win in this space of providing a digital platform to cities. Just by a function of not being hardware dependent and being from its start and from its inception. I think this gets back to a little bit to what Luke was talking about as right place, right time, and having that benefit of being a young company. But yeah, having that kind of origin story in an entirely digital platform, I felt like was really important to getting us to where we are today and giving us kind of that right to win in this space.
You have if you start with parking, I think one of the things that's become more clear in retrospect and kind of, I guess, within the last couple of years has become more clear, is that parking is itself, there's a lot of places it leads, right? So enforcement and permits and transit and all the things that we have pursued as a company haven't necessarily been, they've really been by helping our clients solve kind of the next problem. And so we've sort of just followed the road wherever it would take us. For a while, but I think one of the things that's become a little more evident now is that what the industry refers to as curbside management is really weirdly the road we've been walking down without knowing what the road was called. We just kept doing things that were like things cities needed to kind of manage or to help enforce the curb. And now we're ending up in a place where the curb is actually now becoming much more interesting, much more quickly. Interesting meaning complicated. And so when it comes to how do you deal with commercial vehicles or how do you deal with the scooters or how do you deal with TNCs and rideshare, all those are brand new problems that if you start from scratch is really intimidating. But if you've kind of been through the ringer 3 or 4 or 5 times like we have, then you start to see some patterns and you start to say, hey, maybe we don't need to start over here and maybe we can just kind of take the solutions that we've already put in place and just project them onto some new modality, if you will.
Right. It's fascinating to me because I think people hear curb lane management or they think about curb lane management, and you're right, it's changing so much and so rapidly that I think it just cripples them a little bit with fear. Like they just, I don't know what to do. Like there's the commercial loading side of things has expanded so much, and we're thinking about monetization of commercial loading or the other side of the curb and the micromobility element that's sitting right there. Or bike lanes or things like that we're having to kind of manage, and it's interesting to see everybody's different take on how to begin to look at those things. And I try to simplify it into, first we have to have data to understand how it's operating. And I think like a platform like yours, where inherently you're looking at all those different modes that are happening along the curb, begin to give us some feed of data to understand the how, the what, the who, the why at the curb. And it's interesting that you said that you're kind of catching up to it, right? Like you've done all these things, and then you realize, oh, we've done all these things behind us, right? So, give me some examples of some places where you've done some things, and now it's being applied
to a little more holistic curb management.
So probably just setting the stage, I'll let Kate actually talk about this specific example, but I'd say one pattern that we're really excited about at Passport is like the notion of parking as like paying for occupying the curb. And so parking historically has meant like I drive my car up, I put money in parking meter, and that's parking. But conceptually, you're basically renting the curb for a period. And as new renters come into town, UPS, for example, or something, Uber or Lyft, something like that, they're kind of just not paying rent, or they're paying it through some other like permit system that's doing this other thing. And so ultimately, I think where we get really excited about curbside stuff is taking the model of parking payments and trying to extend it to anything that touches the curb. And so at that point, it's not just like $1 an hour or $2 an hour or just a revenue generating mechanism, but you can start actually driving city outcomes that matter. So things like reducing congestion. If you're actually if you have a lever, like a price lever, to start changing incentives for everyone who is renting, quote unquote, the curb, then all of a sudden you can start solving much bigger problems. And I think that's what I know it's what inspires me. I think it inspires us around here quite a bit, is that it's not, parking is really kind of a policy, not just the payment, but it's a way to drive outcomes for a city. And I think what Kate and the team have done with scooters has been a pretty good example of that.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what we've done on the micromobility
sure.
front?
So I think, echoing or, kind of doubling down on the idea that we're using the concept of parking to help cities manage anything that touches their curbside, in this case specifically scooters, but anything that touches or accesses their right-of-way. We are essentially using a model where we're piloting it with 3 cities right now. So the cities of Charlotte, here where we're based out of, Detroit and Omaha. And we have worked with the city to identify a set of zones and attach prices to those zones that are consistent with the kind of policy outcomes that they're trying to achieve. So for example, here in Charlotte, we have a light rail system that goes all through Charlotte. And so we make the price to park for scooters, then this is invoiced to the scooter operators. So we make the price to park along the light rail and at transit stops very, very cheap, or in some cities they make it zero and essentially subsidize the parking. And you make it very expensive to park, for example, in our really dense uptown area in Charlotte. And by creating these price differentials between the different zones, you can drive actually fleet distribution to different zones depending on what you're trying to achieve. So in Charlotte, they really want to use scooters as a first mile, last mile solution. So really encourage them to support public transportation. So that's why we're having the price differential there and trying to get more scooters at the zero or low price parking zones around transit stops. And each city has different goals that they're trying to achieve.
So, and who's paying? Is it the end user? Is it the scooter company? How does that work?
It's the scooter company. So we connect to the scooter companies. We receive data via their API, and we essentially create parking sessions that are mapped to each of these zones and then assigned a rate. In the case of what we're doing right now, we do a free 30 minutes, so your first 30 minutes of every parking session are free because we want scooters to be available for people to use them. But what we really want to disincentivize is scooters sitting, unused for a very extended period of time. So that is, invoiced at the end of every month to each scooter company. So it's really up to the scooter companies how they want to optimize around this kind of model. They might choose to pay the kind of hefty parking of keeping all of their scooters uptown where they know people are going to be using them a lot, or they might, try and take a more holistic or partnership approach with the city and actually do what the city wants them to do and make sure that they're, around the light rail and things like that.
Yeah, one would hope. And you would hope at a certain point, too, we begin to educate the end user that, obviously your destination is your destination, but if there's, same as demand-based pricing in a city with parking, if there's demand-based pricing for the scooter as well, perhaps we could leave it somewhere else so that it's in that fortunate place for the next person to use.
And I think you're hitting on a really important thing there, which is historically it feels like cities have taken on almost the entire burden themselves to change end user behavior, which is really complicated and gets more complicated when rideshare shows up and scooters show up. Everything that shows up, you have to figure out how to, change those users' behaviors now, and it's really tough. And so, our approach and what we're working with cities to do and scooters and generally is let's try and create more of a marketplace like a supply and demand type free market, such that Bird and Lime and Spin in the scooters case are going to have a way easier time changing user behavior or setting like a discount if you park it on the next block or something like that. City is going to constantly struggle to solve a problem like that. But if you can make trade-offs and get scooter companies on the same page with cities and align their incentives, then all of a sudden you can start to have partnerships, meaningful partnerships between cities and private industry that actually help cities achieve whatever their outcomes are.
Yeah, that's a great example. I mean, that collaboration alone begins to break down a lot of the barriers. And when you to go back and talking about renting the curb and what that looks like, I did my first ever curb lane management study here in Uptown in 2010, and the outcome of that study was we need more on-street parking, because in 2010 we hadn't yet gotten to this place where we were thinking about renting the curb. And I imagine if we redid that study right now, parking would be the least prioritized element, because we're thinking about moving people, moving goods, micromobility options and things like that. And the tricky thing is getting those people who traditionally haven't been part of the paying pool, the FedExes, the UPSs, the commercial loaders, the Birds, the Limes, the Spin, all of them to come in as a partner. So how difficult was it when you started these pilots in Omaha, Detroit, and Charlotte to convince the scooter companies to get on board?
So it wasn't too difficult to convince them to get on board, because our vision actually, so what a lot of cities do when they have scooters, as you may or may not be familiar, they tend to set an arbitrary cap and an arbitrary fee, kind of almost like a taxi medallion system. So, for example, here in Charlotte, each scooter company has a cap of $400. And in most other cities, they would pay some kind of arbitrary fee between like $100 and $300 per scooter. So what kind of our value proposition is, or what we pitched to the scooter companies and to the cities, was that instead of setting these kind of arbitrary cap and arbitrary fees, you should actually kind of let free market forces dictate. So a company, hypothetically, should be able to make their own trade-offs and put as many scooters as they want out. But the downside to that, or the alternative to that, is they have to pay for all the parking for those scooters. So it's really up to them to find their kind of equilibrium about what the price and distribution and number are. And I think each company will have a slightly different equilibrium, but if they're all paying into the same kind of model, or they're being charged the same under a model, I think that they will end up at about the same place, probably, in terms of like the number of scooters. So that was very compelling to the scooter companies, and that was not difficult for them to convince them to at least participate in this pilot and kind of see where it goes. And so I think that they really like that model, because instead of having to negotiate a different cap and fee with each city, it's a very scalable model, right? So if a couple cities all of a sudden pick this up, then they don't have to worry about all of the lobbying or government relations personnel that they have to keep on staff to negotiate with each city. It's a much more scalable solution.
Nice.
I think it's been interesting to see how you can have the sorts of negotiations Kate was just describing with those companies and help them find scalable solutions that they don't have to go to every city and like talk with city council and private industry, meeting the friction that is the speed of government is difficult, especially when you're these companies that are funded for growth, and city councils, or every city council, is a new obstacle for you. So figuring out how to scale the policy, basically, not just like the rules on the books, but like what's the technology to actually then do the thing, has been really valuable. And I think one of the things we've discovered in micromobility, commercial loading is another thing where none of these companies are like, oh yes, the system is working very well as it is, as it is, right? So for commercial loading, they're saying like, look, all we're trying to get in is drop a box off and like get moving. We're not trying to like park for an hour. So if there was a spot right out front that I could stop in for 2 minutes at 5 a.m. and not get a ticket, that would save them so much money. So there's a lot of pain that commercial loading vehicles are dealing with as well. Expense, I should say. And a lot of the tension is exactly what you saw explode with Uber and Lyft back in the day. They pushed so hard, there was no real interface, not a technical interface, but there was no real way to interface with lots of cities to scale the way they needed to. And it wasn't that Uber and Lyft, or Uber especially, I guess, was on some totally different page with the cities. It's that there was no real forum for them to do anything else and not totally disappoint their investors. So there's a lot of friction that exists in the system. I think what we see is because of all these clients that we have in our existing relationships, we're in a place where we can actually help scale the relationship between cities and private mobility companies, with mobility defined pretty broadly there.
Right. Well, it's a very broad category. But
Yeah, sure.
It's fascinating to me. You bring up the commercial loading, because everywhere I go, that seems to be the big foray now. It's like, how do we begin to manage commercial loading? I'm fascinated by the fact that the big companies, like, they budget, millions of dollars every year just because they're going to get citations, right? They know they're going to get them for the level of access that they want. Why can't we create that level of access and generate revenue in a more positive way that helps to manage that? And so are you seeing any cities doing anything unique with commercial loading that is beginning to break down that barrier, or is that the next frontier for Passport?
So we're definitely interested and have begun kind of socializing ideas there. We have it's one of my favorite subjects, so I'm going to try and stay brief here, but the thing I would notice in the market that's happened the most is I feel like it's coming up a whole lot more than it used to. To the point you just made, the number of times we'll walk in and chat with a client and they'll proactively bring it up without us even mentioning it is far higher than it was a couple of years ago. And I think, in my experience at least, the story that they should kind of be treated as though they're parking makes sense, which doesn't mean they're paying for an hour or whatever the minimum amount is on a meter to stop for 2 minutes.
Right.
Like, obviously you might want to have different policies there. But you can feel cities recognizing that the problem exists in a we need to solve it sort of way. And it's getting worse.
Yeah.
And so it's exciting. I think we're bringing kind of a relatively unique view in terms of how to solve it, but it's really nice to be met in the market with clients coming to say, hey, we're not exactly sure how to do this, but we acknowledge it's a pretty big problem, and we're curious to hear how you think we could do a good job here.
And it's interesting because it is parking, it is a transaction, but it's much quicker.
Yeah.
It probably should be priced differently to influence turnover, because we definitely need turnover in a much more limited space. It's almost unenforceable though, right? Like in traditional parking management metrics, unless I've got a parking enforcement officer standing out there, it's almost unenforceable. I feel like you've got a solution for this, or you're about to step in it.
It's not perfect.
Yeah.
I'm rolling up my pants legs in excitement here.
Well, I think, first of all, we like to call them, and we picked this up from some city we talked on the road, but we call them curb kisses. So it's
curb kisses.
It's
I
not
like
a parking
that.
session per se, right? It's a much shorter amount of time, and much more frequent maybe. But
Right.
So enforcement is a really big problem here. And this is one of the places that I probably feel like I hear the most divergent solutions, where cities are thinking LPR cameras or extra boots on the ground, or there's various adaptations of traditional solutions. And I think one of the things that's been really powerful in our micromobility pilot that actually scales nicely is the idea that you don't necessarily have to catch every offender. Right. And so if you're dealing with a fleet like Bird, for example, Bird is the one sending you the data. It's not the end user deciding whether to park. Like they're parking in the Bird app, and then that stops their session and starts a parking session conceptually. So it's not the user being a bad actor because they didn't want to pay for parking, because they're not paying for parking. So what you can do is you can actually, in a lot of cases, not all cases, but in a lot of cases, you can actually handle enforcement through pricing. So meaning if you park in the middle of a park that's not supposed to be parked in,
Right.
then it's a parking session. The data comes through. Bird knows the scooter's there. And so you can have a different policy. Kate was referring to zones earlier. You can have a policy that's that park and say, all right, this was a 45-minute session in a place that there wasn't supposed to be a session at all. And that can be priced at like a penalty pricing level versus just kind of a cheap to free thing that it would have been if it would have been 300 feet that way. And so you're depending on GPSs in this case to do a lot of programmatic or automatic enforcement. That does require, of course, that the GPS is precise enough. So you can't say, is this in the middle of the sidewalk or on the side of the sidewalk? That's something that GPS technology just isn't there for yet. But there's a lot of stuff you can do as it relates to kind of macro distributions, where scooters are they in this park or not? Those sorts of things you can, it turns out, actually do programmatically with zero people changing their day-to-day.
Right. And when you think about that from a commercial loading perspective, I mean, it's almost like congestion pricing.
You got it.
The deeper into the heart of the city we go, the more the price is going to be. The longer the dwell time is, the more the price is going to be. The interesting thing about commercial loading to me is that the end user is a direct employee of the payee. So like if I'm renting a scooter and I leave it in the park, it's of no consequence to me. Bird has to pay it and they have to send somebody out to grab it and get it out of the park. But if I drive for FedEx and I dwell in the wrong place for too long, like that's a negative connotation on my employment record or whatever it may be. I almost wonder if you can use that as a behavioral influence.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in my mind I think that all of these, fleets would optimize very quickly around. I mean, we're seeing with, the scooter companies that we're working with, just implementing this kind of system has really led them to dig into their operations and, really figure out how they can optimize and make sure their scooters are, if they can go pick them up from certain areas, like less than 30 minutes, they're really digging into it. And I would imagine it would be kind of exponentially true for the delivery fleets where they have complete control essentially over their either employee or contract worker, I guess, depending on the application. But
I mean, I think that fascinates me. I would almost like to give some of the delivery fleets like the ability to pay more for better access because that revenue is going to allow for better allocation of amenities at the curb. So let's capture that not through citations but through them willingly pay. And it will change the behavior of some of them, but FedEx or UPS is probably going to go wherever they want to go, and let's let them do it.
Let's let them do it.
Yeah.
One thing related to that is really interesting is I know Seattle's a leader on this front, but the idea of not having like one specific type of use for a chunk of curb. So dividing it up during the day, for example, or weekends versus weekdays, something like that allows you to do some of the stuff you were just saying too. And it's a little hard from a policy perspective today because everything has to be different in the morning than it is in the afternoon or whatever. But if you have some kind of programmatic system that UPS and FedEx can say, like, this is a parking zone until 7 a.m., like no one's there until 7 a.m., but you can go and it's pretty close to free if you go in the morning. But then maybe it becomes parking, and then maybe towards the evening it becomes delivery and drop off again. You can start not only incentivizing behavior within the day, but also saying like, hey guys, let's move this to off hours, or you can come during the middle of the day. It's just going to cost you a lot more. And so these are the sorts of things that honestly the technology part isn't necessarily the crazy part, but it's just getting the platform in place and coming up with what sort of pricing you want to put in place to drive a specific outcome. And at this point, and this is where it gets really exciting, you're talking outcomes, right? And you're talking about like, what do I want to happen in downtown Seattle, or what do I want to happen in like downtown Boston? And if that's what I want to happen, then what should I do? And technology is not in the way of you being able to do it anymore, right? It's not your notepad where you wrote down all the license plates of UPS trucks or, whatever it is, or even your computerized system where you wrote down all the license plate numbers of UPS trucks. You're kind of past the technology hurdle. And at that point, it's more of a policy question, which is a a really good place to be if you're in a city. Not to say it's easy, but at least you have the option of doing much more powerful stuff. And dynamic pricing, as you mentioned earlier, is a great example of like even a base level of dynamism opens up a whole lot of behavioral economic stuff that cities currently can't do because they can't do basic price tweaking without a whole lot of work.
That's right. Well, and you wouldn't believe how much of a hurdle it still is to get some of those things approved in places where the idea of implementing paid parking as a function, or the idea of implementing dynamic pricing as a function, just goes over like a lead balloon. So yeah, it's tough. Now, I think there's one final challenge when we talk about curb management and the dynamic nature. Yeah, one, because you're right. The technology is there. If we can get past the enforcement of wanting to have everything enforced, the communication of what's happening at the curb. If my curb is loading until 7 a.m. and then parking until 2 p.m. and then TNCs and then loading again, and like, how do I communicate that right? You either have the old school method is you've got like a 17-foot tall sign that has time buckets on it and nobody knows what the heck's going on, or you've got to have some type of dynamic communication out there. And I haven't seen anything yet that gets me to a place where, as a driver, I know what's going on.
Yeah, I think there's still a little bit of a lag there, because I think if you look at like a lot of the mobile payments for parking apps, there are apps that will like immediately send you a notification if you try and park in a zone where you're not allowed to park during those hours or something like that. So the communication is responsive, I think, to what you're trying to do, but we want to get to a place where it's driving behavior, where you're actually able to tell somebody like, don't go park in this really busy area, because it's going to be, you're not going to be able to find a parking spot or something. It's like 100% at capacity. And so I think that's when you really get to be able to drive mass, like large scale or mass behaviors, when you can predictively or tell people ahead of time or in advance where to go and direct things that way.
Do you think we're getting close to that?
I'll let Luke answer that one. I think he's a little closer to the parking stuff.
It's a really hard problem, and I think our philosophy is, because parking is kind of distributed everywhere throughout a city, you can't depend on one choke point. Like if I just put up signs, or if I just do something like that, you're not going to get the message out, and getting the message out is really hard. Our general approach, and it's not, it's going to take time, is to make it so that basically that information just persists in as many places as possible. So it shouldn't be, I have to have this city's parking app, whatever it is, and go in and check and plan my route, and then jump over to Google Maps and like da-da-da-da-da-da-da. It can't be like this 12-step planning process that no one does. Instead, if you can kind of take that pricing information and that availability information that Kate referenced and embed it into as many things as possible, so that it ends up being in front of people, not because they went looking for it, but because it's relevant to
it found them.
Their thing. Mm-hmm. It found them, exactly. Then that's when, I guess that's when the user can make decisions. And ideally, in a lot of cases, it's not even an explicit decision. It's not like, let me figure out where I want to park, but it's, maybe your routing just gets changed a little bit by the app, or maybe you get a discount if you come 30 minutes later, or there could be some smart stuff that doesn't require users to actively like pick their parking zone, which is certainly not a cognitive process for most people these days. But you could get some of the same behavioral stuff we were talking about a second ago, where companies are saying like, it's just going to be faster for you. Like me as a navigation app, it's going to be a better navigational route for you if I take you over there. Or if you're coming to Starbucks and it's like super crowded, then maybe I try and distribute that over time a little bit better, and I'm willing to adjust my pricing for it. Like all this stuff takes time. It takes many parties. But I think what's interesting is that the transformation, similar to many other transformations, is that the city doesn't have to solve the whole thing themselves, right? There's not like a super sign or a blimp or something that you need to float up in the air to tell everyone. Instead, you need to, and I don't mean partner from a legal perspective, but you need to find partners, technology providers or apps that people use, or things where you can take the information to them, as you said.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing this a lot, especially with the cities that we work with very closely and are piloting things on, especially with the scooter pilot. I think for a long time, cities have been very prescriptive about, especially in parking, curbside management, about what's happening in their cities. And I think we're really shifting into kind of an era, if you will, of needing more partnership, I think, with cities needing more partnership to get to these kind of results. And I think that's, one thing that we're very focused on is trying to be, good partners and pilot a lot of these, solutions that we've thought of, these kind of ideas and concepts that we have. And I think that that kind of partnership, especially when you bring in, a private company like, scooter companies or UPS, FedEx, that's when you really kind of have the optimal parties at the table to really make something happen, when you have buy-in from, I think, all those, three parties essentially.
And it's really surprised me how it's not, as Kate said earlier, like a negotiation or that you have to kind of like pull a switch on somebody. Everyone's like, yeah, this could be better. And whether that's because of the cap or because there's just no delivery parking zones, or like everyone's pretty much trying to like keep utilization high. It's just been really hard to do that in a way that puts private industry and cities on the same team. And I think that's ultimately what's shifting right now.
Well, I think when we all realize that our goals are moving in the same direction,
Exactly.
The end game may be different. Mine's revenue driven, the cities may be optimization driven, but both of those things can work towards the same end game.
That's right.
Are you finding? So I mean, it's great to hear that this is happening and partners are collaborating. Are you finding this happening in cities of all scales, or is it happening kind of at the top down, larger cities, and does it find its way to the medium and smaller size cities?
Yeah, I think it's definitely focused, especially right now, on the top tier cities. Number one, because I think that they have the ability to be a little more proactive and plan. I think they have the resources to plan out a little more in advance. They have the density that these kind of private companies want in order to, optimize their business operations. So, for example, scooter companies, they just came to Omaha, this year, and we helped with the rollout there. But that was, certainly, as nice as Omaha is, that was certainly not their, primary launch market. They're going for the San Franciscos and the LAs and, San Diego's and Chicago's, they've tried and they're finally in Chicago at a small scale. But really those places where the density warrants their investment there, where they're going to get the unit economics, the per unit economics to work. And so I think it's going to have a trickle-down effect. I think a lot of the Tier 1 cities are definitely the focus right now, and I'm sure that a lot of, pilots or concepts or policies that they adopt will trickle down, I'm sure, to some of like the second, third, and so on tier cities.
Which actually works really well for us, that pattern, because we can kind of solve the problem in a relatively small number of places. And our technology or the solutions we're providing aren't, like Atlanta specific or Chicago specific. We're trying to build tools for cities to implement their policies. And so if city number one, Atlanta and Chicago want to have two totally different kind of price curves, you could say, for delivery vehicles, then there's no reason you couldn't do that. And in fact, in the micromobility pilot, we see different pricing curves and zone setups based on outcomes. And so if you build a kind of bottoms up system or solve the core problem, I guess, versus getting too city specific and give the cities the room to implement within the sandbox, I guess you could say, then so far it feels like the sorts of patterns we've been talking about today are the sorts of things that scale to a lot of different use cases, acknowledging kind of implicitly that every city is going to be a little bit different.
Interesting. And sounds like there's a lot going on today that y'all are wrestling with. What is Passport looking for 3-5 years from? What is the next thing that's going to start shifting where you go and where your clients and cities go?
So the big thing for us is really just to stay. So when we say clients around here, we're talking about cities, municipalities, and private operators. It's really keeping an eye on how their problems are evolving. Like one of the crazy things about all this is I think it's fairly, there's a high probability of missing if you try and project more than a year or so out in terms of what Passport's going to be doing, even more so than a couple of years ago. And so for us, we've been talking about a lot of these ideas, and I think these are not just like cool product ideas or like pilot things that we're going to try. These are like our actual opinion on how we think like curbs should be managed in the future. Now, something could totally happen tomorrow or 6 months from now that kind of blows all that up, but it seems to be based on pretty solid principles. And in our tests so far with cities, it's been received well and has kind of helped accomplish the goals we're looking for. So I think we're pedal to the metal on making this real. The key is just as you have all these parties coming in to just make sure you keep your clients first and don't get distracted by the fact that you're working with huge companies who maybe sometimes have other desires, and just make sure that the core mobility problem for cities stays on the kind of front line for us.
Yeah, I think it's very important. There are a lot of different ways that, Passport could shift if needed, I think, over the next 3 to 5 years. And we are constantly, I think, shifting and reevaluating our strategic priorities. But I think the most important thing is really keeping, our client and our customer first, because if we don't have a solution that cities want, we're not going to be in business anymore. So I think that it really requires that constant, partnership with our clients, and especially really close, communication and partnership with cities who are kind of at the forefront of leading these things, because those are going to be your leading indicators, right? Like where the market's going. If there's, all of a sudden a multitude of cities that are starting to think the same way, about things. And so I think that's the most important thing for us is really just to continue to be a client-focused and partnered organization.
One other thing that's interesting that's happening, you said things that groups of cities do, Kate, and there's a lot of activity happening now within like data standards and some of the some efforts that to me feel like they're going to really impact the industry in pretty dramatic ways. And so I get excited about things like data standards, but the implication there is it's not even partner or vendor driven change, or it's not like necessarily a private industry change. It's other party that's helping to basically break down silos in places that silos have always existed, and it's very likely going to be kind of a pro city thing that happens. It's it's hard to know exactly what that thing is, but in a world where data can flow more freely between tool number 1 and tool number 2, or system number 1 and system number 2, or even client number 1 or city number 1 and city number 2, a lot of new things become possible. And I think urban mobility or municipal mobility has historically been locked up for a number of different reasons. Like tools haven't really talked to other tools very much, and so that's something I'm really excited about. Whether Passport does it or not, I think there's going to be a lot of really cool stuff that puts things that probably seem kind of like Star Trek-y today for cities that actually end up in their hands a lot sooner than they were thinking, just because silos are falling and people are really innovating right now.
No, I'm 100% with you. Like the data side of things has always been fascinating to me. We've moved into this realm where we're all trying to be smart cities, and we're all trying to create ways to leverage data to make better policy decisions. And parking should be leading the way in that, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like we have more data than I think most anything that's happening out there, and we know where people are coming from, how long they're staying, what they're doing. We've never been able to harness that. So you're right. These data standards that are going to allow cities and their data scientists to go in and do better data analytics and manipulation could open the door to some really great things. That's
right.
That's fascinating. So
and even data flowing from tool to tool. So things like city planning, being able to interface with more of a transactional system like ours is really interesting. And it's not maybe even that technologically complex, but it has been complex because the connection between those two has been absent.
I think we focused for so long, and this was 10 years ago, about making those two tools talk to one another. and somebody came along somewhere and said it's not about them talking to one another, it's just about them speaking the same language. And it's fascinating that we're entering that realm. So the next few years could be really, really, really interesting as we start to bring that together.
I think we're in a pretty good place at a pretty good time.
Yeah, y'all got into the industry at a perfect time, right? So good job. Well, this has been fascinating. We could talk curb management and data until the sun comes up later, but so if people want to find out more about the work y'all are doing at Passport, where can they find information about like case studies and the company and things like that?
So the best place is probably our website, passportinc.com. We publish a bunch of case studies up there, including some of the curb management stuff that we're talking about. There's going to be a lot of activity over the next couple of quarters, but also just reaching out to someone on our team. We have a lot of folks who think about this probably more than they should. So, and we love hearing from clients or potential partners and all that kind of stuff, because this is definitely not something we can do in a silo. And so we are constantly looking for folks to help educate us on how to do it right.
Nice. Well, I appreciate y'all taking the time today. Any closing thoughts, shout outs you want to give?
Oh, I wasn't ready. No, I do really appreciate, I think the Passport, as we were talking about with parking, Passport has really exceeded expectations in terms of the level of excitement that I wasn't expecting what not only the job, but the industry was going to be like. And it's really just been a pretty wild ride in a really good way. And so I've had a blast, and obviously, I think Kate and I both really love talking about this stuff. So
yeah, I think I think a lot of us around the office kind of joke that our parents probably don't know what we do, and they're just like, oh, they work for a parking company. But it's really such a great time in this industry there's so much to, I think, explore, and so much that's so undefined, and it's, a really great place and a really great opportunity to be into, and, something that we have a lot of passion for.
Yep, that's right.
And now they can listen to the Parker X podcast and get a sense of what you do. You'd be surprised how many of my family members actually know that I don't design parking lots now. So.
Oh, my dad will probably be commenting on your website, or he'll be reviewing the episode, giving it all the likes.
Fantastic.
Hey, Mom.
Yeah.
Hey.
All right. Well, I will give one shout out to Nathan Barry, who brought us together today. Sorry you couldn't be here, and hope you're not freezing your took us off too much in Iowa. But thanks, man, for bringing us together, and thank y'all, Kate and Luke, for being willing participants in this and chatting with me today. So,
well, thank you,
Brett.
Brett.
It was great. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to the Parker X podcast. We sincerely appreciate it and hope you are enjoying our content. Please remember to rate, review, comment, subscribe, and share. And follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. The following has been a production of Parker X.